Welcome back to RebPsych 2022. You are welcome to send any technical questions to the host through the chat panel located at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to submit a question, please do so in the Q&A panel. Closed captioning is available. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Hello again, folks. Welcome to another session of RebPsych. Again, my name is Srija. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a fourth-year medical student at Yale. I'm a South Asian woman. I've got long, dark hair and a purple blazer and a black shirt on. Thanks to our transcribing team for today. If you'd like to see closed captions from home, please select the live transcript CC option and show subtitle. And if you have any other access needs, please let me know. I am thrilled to introduce our next session. Our next session is titled, just a moment. Our next session is titled Insights on Power, a panel discussion on involuntary treatment and informed consent, featuring three presenters, Kathy Flaherty, Leah Harris, and Leigh Nathan. Kathy Flaherty is the Executive Director of Connecticut Legal Rights Project, Incorporated, or CLRP, a statewide nonprofit agency that provides legal services to low-income individuals with mental health conditions who reside in hospitals or the community on matters related to their treatment, recovery, and civil rights. Kathy combines her personal experience as a recipient of mental health services and her legal background to speak to issues affecting those living with mental health conditions. Kathy is on Twitter at ConConnections, and Kathy has written op-eds and guest blog posts on a variety of topics, including politics, law, mental health, adoptee rights, and soccer. Leah Harris, they, she, is a mad, queer, disabled writer, facilitator, and advocate of Eastern European Jewish heritage. Their work focuses on access, autonomy, and choice, surveillance/technology, the mental health suicide prevention space, the history of carceral mental health, and psychiatric abolition. Their writing has appeared in Rooted in Rights, the Disability Visibility Project, and Mad in America, and in the anthologies We've Been Too Patient, Voices from Radical Mental Health, Fat and Queer, an anthology of queer and trans bodies and lives, and the forthcoming Mad Studies Reader. They live on stolen Minoic lands, also known as Northern Virginia, United States. Their Twitter handle is @LeahIda. Dr. Leigh Nathan is a psychiatrist in private practice. She's a clinical instructor and volunteer with the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health, or PERCH, and a healthcare and recovery integration coordinator with the Housing Collective, a nonprofit that addresses homelessness and affords housing in Western Connecticut. She's an advocate of person-centered process improvement in healthcare and social service delivery. Dr. Nathan received her MD from Temple University School of Medicine. She completed her psychiatry residency at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and completed fellowships in consultation liaison psychiatry, previously known as psychosomatic medicine, and public psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry. Before I yield the stage, just some friendly reminders when it comes to Q&A. Our panelists will speak, then there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience, virtually and in person. Just keep in mind to use I statements, take space and make space, and be thoughtful in your storytelling to avoid graphic details of violence that may be re-traumatizing. And with that, I'm very excited to yield the stage to our panelists. Oh, we can applaud.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the applause, whether in person or virtual. And when I was approached by the folks organizing this conference, I said, sure, I'd be delighted to speak if I can bring other people with me, because I am sure that all of you have been sitting in that auditorium or sitting in your house or your office listening to these presentations and having your mind blown as much as I have been. That's one of the things reasons I love this conference so much. But we very much wanted this to be a conversation between and among the three of us, and then also incorporating all of you. So we have built in plenty of time for questions and answers. So please put them in the Q&A, or for people in the auditorium, they'll deal with that in person. what we want to talk about today are some of the things that we think are wrong with the system and what needs to change, but explain to you our process in getting to where we're at in terms of our thinking. I know for me, listening to the presentations earlier today, that is not the way I thought about the system when I first entered it. And my ideas have changed over time. So as an attorney, we're very much stuck navigating within the system. At least I am as an attorney. We have to follow certain rules. And what we'll do is give a little bit more of an introduction to each of us, and then we'll move on into various topics of conversation. I'll start because I'm already talking. I am a psychiatric survivor. My first year of law school, I was civilly committed to a psychiatric institution. And I had the experience of showing up for an appointment at my psychiatrist's office and her telling me that she was putting me in a hospital. I had no idea that that is something that could happen in the United States, much less anywhere in the world. I walked out of the building and into the waiting arms of the police. Fortunately, that was as bad as that situation got. But I did have that experience of involuntary being forced to go to a hospital. And like many of us who have had that experience, and the tiniest bit of a trigger warning here as well, is having forced medication and being subject to restraint and seclusion. But following that experience, I continued to engage with the system on a voluntary basis for pretty much decades, and had experiences of checking myself into the hospital, participating in treatment recommended, which included a lot of medications given the time frame in which I was receiving treatment. But despite being told by the doctors who were treating me that these were medications that I'd have to be on the rest of my life, because I had a chemical imbalance in my brain that the medications were designed to correct, I found that not to be true and was able to taper off medication, and for better or for worse, feel the feelings, live the life, engage with the world around me, and not numb it with medications. I've had the experience of representing people over a number of years who, some of whom feel the same way about the system, but I also have the experience of knowing people who have looked to the system for help and have found it. So that is something I always struggle with, is how are some people finding what they need from the system, yet other people just aren't. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Leah to introduce herself a little more, and followed by Leigh.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for getting us going. So I really come to this work as a second generation psychiatric survivor, as well as a survivor of family policing and family separation. And I'll be talking a little bit later about how these are intertwined. Just to share, some difficult content I'm going to be sharing, but so just a little content warning there. The story, begins in part with my mom, who had been forcibly hospitalized at least 20 times. I'm still collecting the accurate numbers over the course of her very brief life, until her death, which I really track to the effects of forced antipsychotics over the course of many, many years, as well as forced poverty, which is the reality for so many disabled folks. She passed at the age of 46, which is a year younger than I am now. Our family was also forcibly separated by the family policing system. I was 5 years old when that happened. And, I was raised by my maternal grandparents, who really positioned my mother as being at fault for the harms that she experienced and as responsible for the family separation if she had just done better, at complying. And so as a young person, I really couldn't help but internalize these messages. I didn't have an alternative framework. It was just this very, simplistic equation, mental health care is good. And if you resist it, then that's just a sign of your illness, right? I had my own surreal experiences as a teen, involuntary in psych wards and institutions. And that began to plant some seeds of skepticism for me in terms of this narrative I'd been told about my mother, about the system. And so after her death, I was 20 years old. As a young adult, I just kind of went on this quest to figure out what the hell happened here, what happened to her, what happened to us. One of the things I did was order her psych records, which is, a giant stack. This took place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so that kind of took me on this journey of discovery that eventually connected me with the MAD movement, psychiatric survivors, cross-disability activists. And it really began this process of unlearning, like one of the previous panel discussed, unlearning everything that I had been taught about mental health. And it was just a complete worldview shift. And that has continued to inform my writing and advocacy to this day.
And I'll go ahead. My name is Leigh Nathan. I am a psychiatrist. I practice here in Connecticut. As Kathy shared, I did my training in Colorado and completed a fellowship in consultation liaison psychiatry, and then in public psychiatry here at Yale. And I've been on the membership of the Perch faculty since then, have worked in the outpatient community setting on ACT teams, in clinics, and in the homeless response system, where I've been helping to improve the nature of the care we deliver to people who are interfacing with the mental health system and the homeless response system. And prior to my time in healthcare, I was a manufacturing engineer and have had the great fortunate experience to work in some healthcare settings that have robust process improvement cultures. And so I've developed this identity as an advocate for person-centered process improvement. I may explain a little bit about what that is, but basically throughout my working history in psychiatry, I've come to unlearn a lot of what I was taught and really start to understand what person-centered practices really are. And I'm still learning those things. And I can see that a lot of our laws and a lot of our regulations and a lot of our practices do not align with person-centeredness. I chose psychiatry because I was just quite frankly very curious about about the human experience, and I didn't really understand at all when I entered this field as a medical student the statutes that guide our work. And I use the word work to distinguish between our care. I don't think that my care can often align with my work because of the ways the laws are set up and because of the power that has been granted to people with my credential. And I've come to understand that, the only word I can use to describe this, it's not a thought, it's not a feeling, it is a conviction that we shall not do coercive things to human beings. Coercion is wrong, we shouldn't do it. So I bring that to my profession, and I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile those things. And I've enjoyed the conversations I've had with Kathy and with the community of people with lived experience here in Connecticut. And it's been wonderful to talk with Leah and to get to know her and her views as well. And so I just feel like I'm just growing into this space, and also emphasizing the importance of looking at our history, our world history, our legal history, case law, to understand what guides our work. And I'm currently preparing to return to consultation liaison psychiatry and looking at the intersection of decisional capacity and involuntary hospitalizations due to concerns of dangerousness.
Thank you so much to both of you for introducing yourselves. And now to talk about our conversation, we're going to talk about power, involuntary treatment, informed consent. And I'd really like to start with something you just were referring to a bit in your intro, Leigh, which is, what is your perception as a psychiatrist of what informed consent is and or should be? And can you tell us how that has informed, as you said, your work, not the care?
Sure. Well, informed consent by medical legal standard is the ability for a person to consent to a medical recommendation. And there's three parts of informed consent. There's having competence, that's the legal term. The medical term for that is having decisional capacity, and I'll talk in a minute about what decisional capacity is. But having the competence to make a decision, being adequately informed, and not being coerced. And if those three things are intact, then we call that informed consent. And really what informed consent is trying to support is mutual understanding, that human experience of understanding one another and trying to be helpful to somebody by offering assistance. We've kind of sullied that with all the different factors that go into modern healthcare. But my work around decisional capacity is to understand how we assess and when we assess decisional capacity and in what healthcare settings we do that. It took me many, many years to figure out that the one place we're not doing that really is in situations where we're concerned about psychiatric dangerousness. We have a different set of laws. Psychiatrists are in a strange, it's a bewildering situation sometimes where if the patient is a person with a medical brain problem, then we use one set of laws. If they're a person with a psychiatric brain problem, we use a different set of laws. And it's very confusing for trainees. And, so I'm really trying to untangle this, especially since we're being told that psychiatric diseases are neurologically based, psychoneurologically based. So when there is a concern about dangerousness, many of the statutes in states across the country, and they do vary widely on criteria, have a dangerousness requirement, as opposed to the dangerousness would be the reason why somebody would be involuntarily treated or admitted, as opposed to their ability to consent to that treatment and to have decisional capacity about what they should expect when they're there. Quite frankly, the evidence to suggest that it would be a helpful hospitalization, a tour perhaps of such a place to know what they might expect. We leave those things out, and people just find themselves in hospital settings. And my work on the outpatient side, just people are often very bewildered at what they experience, and so we do a lot of work to help them recover from that. I'll stop there. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Leigh. I know from my side as a patient and a service user and a participant in this system, my recollection of what happened when that conversation was going on, especially about the involuntary hospitalization, I felt that all those concepts of consent, information, voluntariness kind of seemed to go out the window because, having signed myself into the hospital voluntarily, and I put that in air quotes, the first time I was hospitalized, it was because they were sending me there anyway. Like, that really was not anything that I would call a free
Kathy,
choice.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. The fire alarm went off. Could I just pause you for like 2 minutes and just revisit?
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. Folks, the fire alarm went off, so why don't we just leave the building, and hopefully if things are clear, we're just going to revisit. For the folks online, we're going to try to restart in a couple of minutes if everything is clear, but thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much for your patience and welcome back, everybody. Nothing like a little break in the middle of a panel to get the excitement flowing for the rest of the conversation. So I'll try to remember where we were. And I think Leigh had already talked about her ideas as a psychiatrist about what informed consent could and should be. And I was just in the middle of talking about how I experienced that as a patient. And note that I'm going to talk a little bit about involuntary medication. But when you talk about forced psychiatry, whether that's being put in a hospital or then once you're there and you are basically told, show up at a little window to get a little cup of water and some pills, people are not usually giving you the printout of those medications, and they're just not having conversations with you about the risks and the benefits of taking the medication, not taking the medication. It really becomes a power play, which is why we put the word power in the title, because it's either you comply or you are told we will inject you with medication. And that can involve being told to be in a room and, if necessary, be held down and injected with medication. And it's not even the medication that they normally would give you in the pill. It's like a sedative sort of thing to knock you out and calm you down. And we heard a little bit about that this morning from Dr. Hatch about how these medications are often used in carceral settings to keep people calm. I want to turn things over to Leah to talk about informed consent issues.
Thanks so much, Kathy. So yeah, like Dr. Jen, I sometimes use humor as a little bit of a coping mechanism. And so, there's this term, free and informed consent, that feels increasingly like a rainbow unicorn that only exists in our dreams for some of the reasons that Kathy just mentioned. One dimension, I'll talk about the technological dimension and then the analog dimension. But this is a whole other panel, but I think it's really important to look at, the whole world of mental health apps of all different kinds. There's like 10,000 of them at this point. Of course, you're required to, quote, consent to a bunch of legalese that you probably won't read, or if you do try to read it, you probably will not understand it all. And that's in order to access any kind of services or supports that you might need. If you don't opt in, you can't access it, right? So that makes consent fuzzy, and then it also makes me think of the crisis text line, as some of you know the story with that. And I wonder how many people would have freely and fully consented to use crisis text line services if they knew that the company was handing over their data to an AI customer service bot company that it owned, right, to train customer service bots. So using suicidal people's data in that way, in a highly unethical way. Would people have opted into that? Maybe, but it really blurs the ideas around consent. And then, the other piece I want to talk about briefly is sort of the ways that consent is blurred in all of these forms of old school force under the guise of diversion, right? So different sorts of diversion programs. There's no meaningful consent here. It's framed as a choice, right? When we think about the proliferation of treatment courts, problem-solving courts, mental health courts, drug courts, there's so many of them. And then also involuntary outpatient commitment statutes, or I kind of see these as kind of interconnected. Is it really free and fully informed consent if you're given a choice between, taking the treatment court or then being faced with hospitalization and or incarceration, right? Carceral options. So, there's a quote from a fantastic report that I recommend called Beyond Courts. The website is beyondcourts.org, and I really encourage y'all to check it out. From a report that's a part of that called Problem Creating Courts, They say that coerced services under the threat of incarceration are ineffective, violent, and inhumane, unquote. So that's just, there's so much more that we could say about this, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to kind of complicate what is free and fully informed consent.
Thank you so much, Leah. I want to talk a little bit now about how our perspectives regarding involuntary treatment may have changed over time. As I said in my introduction, the first time it happened to me, it was something that I just did not know could literally exist and could possibly be legal. In any other kind of medical treatment, people talk about giving respect to people's autonomy and choice, and they encourage you to seek a second opinion. They don't really do that in psychiatry. If anything, there's a second opinion gathered, but it's gathered by the facility to support a petition to treat someone against their will. You do not routinely see people being even offered the opportunity to consult with somebody else to see if a different professional might have a different perspective on what could help somebody. And I know for me, what the ability of psychiatrists to force what is really a recommendation, but somehow becomes, through the power of the law, a forced order. It taught me that I could not be honest in my relationships with certain treating providers. Because once I learned that some people had the legal authority to be able to write orders that could result in my being brought to a hospital, held against my will, I was never going to, and I don't know why anybody thinks that people would continue to be honest in those conversations. So I'd like to turn it over to Leigh to talk about what is that like from the psychiatrist perspective.
Need to unmute before I can answer. Thanks, Kathy. Well, honestly, it's been, let's see, I graduated from residency in 2010. So 12 years of practicing, I'm sorry, graduated from medical school in 2010. So 12 years of practicing as a resident, fellow, or individual practitioner. I have to say, I'm still putting it together myself. It's very confusing because, like you mentioned, Kathy, I also know people both personally and professionally who say, I got the help I needed during the course of even an involuntary course of treatment. So, where I am today on this is that if we presume there's one right answer, we're getting it wrong. There's something for we've got to make it so there's something for everyone here, and ask ourselves, how could we arrange this so that it's so that people would voluntarily do as much as they possibly could, so people would access what they're inclined and drawn towards. And again, it goes back to understanding. Coercion and understanding can't exist at the same place at the same time. The human, belongingness and understanding, we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's not coercion in there, but there is a sense of belongingness. That involves conversation, it involves time to contemplate and come back. It involves repairing parts of relationships where there's a bit of a misunderstanding and coming back together and saying, oh, let's repair it. Those are essential parts of healthcare. When a person who has or believes they have knowledge that can help alter someone's life for the better, whether it be medical or psychiatric, is involved in a conversation with the person whose life we're talking about, these often need to be lengthy conversations. And so the things that I try to make sure I do is just look at my task list from an employee standpoint or from a worker standpoint and say, okay, how can I get through as much of the task so that I can make as much time as I possibly can to have the deepest possible conversations. When they're necessary, we're not going to get around it. So that's really, that's why I keep talking about process improvement and person-centered process improvement. Ultimately, we're saying person, person first, but recognizing that in order for workers to be person-centered, we kind of have to look at worker-centered changes as well, but with the final goal of making time for those relationships, because it is that understanding that can lead to agreeableness. And I'm not saying agreeing with medicine, I'm just saying both parties agreeing on what to do next, kind of in that shared decision-making philosophy and practice.
Leah, can you talk about how some of these things played out for you and perhaps for your mother as well, from what you've been able to find out from her medical record?
Yeah,
All
yeah.
this support in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kathy. I think that something that's not spoken about as much is the impact of forced treatment, not just on the individual, but on the entire family, right? And my mom, as I said, lived in forced poverty as a psychiatrically disabled woman, with, one of the most stigmatizing diagnoses of all, which is schizophrenia. So, inherently you're not going to be trusted or believed, in that context. Looking back now, I see that, she needed support as a single parent, with a disability, living in poverty. She needed parental support, some additional resources. But instead, we encountered CPS and the family policing system, which is a term coined by Dr. Dorothy Roberts. So, these involuntary hospitalizations my mother experienced were these little separations, right? So this is from my 0 to 5 years. And all of you who understand trauma and the neurobiology of trauma understand, like, oh, those are kind of critical years. So these hospitalizations that happened were fodder that were used against her in court when she was trying to fight to retain custody of me. And she did fight for 5 years before ultimately losing. And so I'm very old, so this all happened in the late 70s. But, I've said over and over, if my story was obsolete, I would just sit down and be quiet, but it isn't. It's anything but. I would say almost nothing has changed since then. That might be a hyperbolic statement, but that's how I feel. According to the most recent data that I've seen, some of the research has been done by a Dr. Mary V. Seaman. And it says that 50% of mothers or parents diagnosed with schizophrenia will have their children taken away. That's, the data we have, at least 50%. So I think it's really, really important to understand that, involuntary treatment has an impact, not just on that person. It was certainly traumatizing for my mom, but for all of us. And, that early trauma that I experienced because of that cycle that she went through, and as a result, I went through, continues to impact. This has lifelong intergenerational impact. So I think all the more reason to so carefully consider when, we're doing this, the harm that can happen across an entire family.
Thank you, Leah. Leah, I'd like to just ask you quickly. Leah was talking about how the forced treatment not only impacts the patient, but really their entire family, social circle. But can you tell a little bit, two questions really, is how do psychiatrists view someone who has that long history or repeated history of involuntary treatment? And do you believe that forced treatment does any kind of injury to the person who's part of the system that perpetrates it?
Thank you, Kathy. The first question was, here I am, like, remember the first, go one at a time, if you would.
Like, if you're dealing with somebody who has a repeated history, what goes into the sort of calculations that a psychiatrist might make?
Well, psychiatrists, we are we're different people. We're humans who practice psychiatry. So I can only speak for myself. When there's a long history of involuntary treatment, my only question is, at what point are we going to try something different? And what kind of healing does this person need? Presumably they may need, I don't want to presume, but oftentimes, that comes with a strong sense of trauma. So how do I support this person in recovering from a traumatic experience or many traumatic experiences? I will say that in order to survive in medicine, we often have to be, tunnel vision comes on. We have to just accept it. When we're surrounded by things we cannot change, we start to look at the things we can. And that means sometimes we often exclude the things that we just are powerless over. And that may seem like insensitivity, and it may seem like, failure to recognize another person's suffering, but really after repetitive exposure, it just becomes something that we do just to keep coming. So I always have to remind myself that even if I am witnessing repetitive things, repetitive traumas to people that I have no power over changing, that's nothing like what they're experiencing. They're going through the trauma. So I have to remind myself to step out of the place of self-protection and into the place of how can I be most supportive. And also, from a system standpoint, where is the breakdown? Where do we put the wrench? What is wrong here? Is it must not be something going on in the hospital. Maybe it's something outside the hospital. Maybe it has nothing to do with healthcare at all. Maybe it's a social service thing. Maybe it's a, who knows? But really trying to guide everyone involved to maybe shift the focus away from what we've been looking at for so long and onto something new, which is important but challenging sometimes. What was your second question, Kathy?
I think you really kind of answered it in what you were saying in terms of the effect on you and kind of how you have to focus on just what's in front of you at the moment. So I think you answered both questions, to be honest. What I'd like to talk about, and I just want to remind our virtual participants, put your questions in the Q&A section, because this will be the last topic of our conversation that will go till about 3 o'clock. And then we'll have, or 3:05, and then we'll have 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. And we really envision this as a conversation that included you as well. So talking about what we think needs to change, starting with a abbreviated conversation due to time of how we got to where we are in the first place, because I do think for people who don't know that history, we want to give them some sense of that. But what do we think the systems, not necessarily the individuals in the systems, but that the systems themselves need to change? And I'm going to start with Leah and then go to Leigh.
Thanks, Kathy. So just to briefly kind of touch on a little bit of the historical stuff, if we have time. Is that all right? Okay, great. So obviously there's a huge history in terms of how did we get here, right? And I think Dr. Hatch's talk gave us an excellent overview of that. I also recommend Liat Ben Moshe's Decarcerating Disability for some really interesting perspectives, important perspectives on this question. But I think it's super important to view involuntary treatment as part of this carceral mode of care that we've resorted to, and I would say become addicted to in various ways, right? Ever since the settler colonial US became a thing, or, since folks arrived on these shores, the settlers. And like, Dr. Hatch said, I'm paraphrasing here, but the prison and the asylum have always been intertwined in this place. And that goes back to Europe, of course. I think it's also really important to consider how the rise of the asylum, the prison, the poorhouse, all of these places that we put people that we don't know what to do with or don't fit into societal or cultural norms. It has paralleled industrialization, right? And I think that's important to note. And of course, few people want to go to these places voluntarily, so there had to be all of these legal mechanisms, right, to compel them to go and to keep them there. And then, of course, there's the big lie, which you'll hear this all the time, which is that deinstitutionalization has failed, right? And then because of that, we have to bring back the asylum. That is a huge lie. It didn't fail. It actually is an incomplete process. It hasn't happened yet, right? That's a very big difference, between something not occurring and something failing. So, this narrative, unfortunately, though, has led to all of these calls, as I said, to bring back the asylum and all the forced outpatient kind of commitment regimes that I mentioned earlier. So, the idea is like, if we can't bring the asylum back, we can't rebuild all of those things, then we can bring the asylum into the community. And I'll leave it there for now.
And kind of adding on to that, like I was sharing earlier, my exploration of my identity as a psychiatrist and the power that's been appointed to people with my credential has led me to look at history and case law. And one of the most striking pieces of history that I didn't know and I thought I'd share with everyone is really where suicide laws emerged from, and how we started to connect suicide with insanity. It wasn't by mental health experts. It wasn't by scientists. It wasn't by therapists. It was by King Edward the Peaceful of England in year 967, who decided that suicide was an affront to the church and an affront to his kingship, that one of his subjects would decline to be a subject of the king. And so at that point, a person who died by suicide would forfeit their estate. Their estate would be forfeited to the king. And I believe it would, well, I don't want to get too graphic, but horrible things would happen to their body at the time of their death. So the only exclusion to that was if they were thought to be in the throes of madness. And prior to that time, people generally didn't consider suicide to be an act of madness, but all of a sudden juries who were comprised of people's neighbors said, well, no, I'm thinking maybe they were in the act of madness, because that way their family would get to keep their house. They get to keep the estate of the deceased. And so the laws go way back to, we're in an era where we're looking at how colonial laws and practices have impacted our lives today. And this is an example of one of those things. So I just wonder how much of psychiatry has been shaped by politics and religion. Did that answer? Should I go on, Kathy, or was there an additional question to?
Well, I just wonder if you wanted to start talking about some of the things that you think need to change. And then
Sure,
I'll
absolutely.
begin with my thoughts and we'll finish it out with Leah's perspective on that.
Sure. The thing I need to change, we should look at, is the process. And I can't help but go back to the process improvement mindset. When we map out how things go, and they don't always go the same way, but if we look at all the different ways that things happen, where people find themselves in situations where they don't want to be by virtue of mental health statutes, let's map out the process. Let's look at where laws were, where a legal standard was part of that process. Let's look at where people felt understood. Let's ask where dignity was compromised. Let's ask where dignity was honored, and really use these, process improvement science, it's out there, to assess what we do and how we do it, and to really, in a humanistic way, I'm not saying make this a sterile scientific practice, but really look at all the ways where dignity is compromised and try to find new ways to do that, and look at all the ways that dignity is optimized and keep those things, and then just continuously improve the process. I think ultimately what this is going to take, though, is looking at the laws looking at the statutes. It's going to take allyship. It's going to take advocacy, mental health and advocates. We've all got to come together and listen to each other. And no one make a decision about how it needs to be. And we got to all come together and say how we think we should try it. We got to be willing to experiment. And we need to recognize that our scientific data on these topics we can't count on it, because it's all taken place in the context of the presence of statutes. We don't live in a society free of statutes. So we can't do a randomized controlled trial to see how a truly non-coercive process might look. So that would be a very challenging thing to undertake, but if there's a state out there that wants to try it, they may find, who knows what they may find. So I'd be really curious to see something like that. And then prior to that, looking at some small things that could happen if we're trying to realistically stop involuntary and especially lengthy hospitalizations around placements. Sometimes people end up in the hospital because they need a place to go. Let's just start placing people from their preferred environment to a different preferred environment. Why do they have to go into the hospital to await placement? Let's find some alternative place for them to be so they can get to their final, placement, if you will. But we see the hospital as being this point where people have to wait for that. And unfortunately, I think that is very traumatizing for a lot of people.
Thanks for bringing all those things up. And I think I want to take some of what you have said and build on it, especially because I'm here as a lawyer. So I have to say, I always appreciate when people say we need to take a look at the laws. And I think if you do start taking a look at the laws, you will realize that the law is actually a big part of the problem. Now, we are doing couple of us are from Connecticut, Leah's from out of state. Leah previously mentioned involuntary outpatient commitment. That is something we do not have in Connecticut because the advocacy community has fought it. It has been proposed multiple times, but what has happened each time is that people with that firsthand lived experience of involuntary treatment were brave enough to share their stories to the Connecticut legislature and say, this did not work for me. This harmed me. This is a terrible idea. And when the people in power actually take the time to listen to the perspectives of the community, the people who would be most impacted by change, the people who are most likely to have good solutions to the problem, you're probably going to end up with better solutions. People attending this, whether virtually or in person, may or may not be aware that the average length of stay in Connecticut Valley Hospital, which is in Middletown, our largest state facility, is longer than 3 years. Even the young adult unit, the average length of stay is more than 1.5 years. How can separating people from their community, from their natural supports for that length of time be good for people? How is that healing for people? How does that represent a recovery-oriented, person-centered system, which is what our system claims to be? And for some people, they may actually experience that. But I think for too many people, especially the people that Connecticut Legal Rights Project represents, that is not their experience of the system. And I really think all of us who are part of the system need to take a hard look at ourselves and to see the roles we play in that system. I've said before, as lawyers, we are forced working within this existing system of laws. And over time, we have spotted the various problems with the laws. That's why there's currently a case pending in Superior Court in Connecticut challenging the constitutionality of our civil commitment statute. Connecticut is one of the rare states where there is no time limit on a person's civil commitment. When I was involuntarily committed in Massachusetts, it had a limit of 6 months. I was discharged after 60 days, which happens to correspond exactly with the amount of insurance coverage I had, and maxing that out. But here in Connecticut, someone who goes to a state operated hospital, especially, can literally spend years locked up. I think one of the two things we have to look at, and I will be wrap this up so we have time for Leah before questions. Really looking at mutual aid and support and community care and things like peer-run respites, but also an affirmative legal right to voluntary services and supports, because that is something when people do want access to that treatment recovery, the services, the supports, if they have no affirmative legal right to get it and it's just not being provided, they're kind of stuck. So those are my ideas. And now I'll turn it over to Leah.
Thank you. Everything you just said, Kathy. I'll add on a few things. So, in our ideal unicorn world where free and informed consent is actually a thing that exists, I can imagine us in the United States adopting the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We haven't done it yet, right? Did I miss it? We haven't done it. No. Yeah. Okay. I was just double checking. Yeah. So we would ratify that as a states party, and we would adopt a rights-based mental health system, right? Because we can, and I totally understand the way that you intended, Leigh, but I think people can be person-centered right into the hospital, right? Like, who determines what's person-centered? I've decided how I'm going to center you. And I know that's not what you meant, but these things can get slippery. So I really like the idea of a rights-based system, right? And it does feel very far away. But if there was the political will, we don't need to, reinvent the wheel. I mean, associated with the CRPD are all of these alternatives to force, right? And some of them have been mentioned, things like supported decision-making. There's great papers out there that I wish I could drop in the chat, but there's papers that really elaborate on what would this look like operationalized in practice, right? In crisis services, for example, a fantastic one by Peter Stastny et al. That I'll try to send if anybody's interested, reach out to me. And so, right, I'd love to see a rights-based system, that basically works to eliminate all forms of coercion and involuntary treatment. And then I would also really recommend that folks check out the work of Susan Steffen. There's a book called Rational Suicide, Irrational Laws. It's like over $100, but maybe your library will carry it. But it is full of proposals that would be humane, rights-based workarounds to our carceral system. And this book is like 500 pages, so this is the super capsule summary. But one policy idea that I think she even has sample policies to this regard, is to limit the liability of outpatient service providers, right? So that they wouldn't have to be so carceral in their response to imminent risk. Of course, excluding outrageous, misconduct or negligence. We're not talking about that. We're talking about someone who rationally has done everything they can, reasonably done, to support this person, right? So to have that liability piece taken off the table would mean that we could support suicidal people in the community, right? To me, it's super simple stuff, but we really lack political will. And then another idea, which I think is just phenomenal, I don't know, some of you saw in the Washington Post, there was an article about a young autistic man who was held in an emergency department for like 2 months, and just this horrific nightmare of a story. And, it just made me think of, Susan Steffen's idea to have Medicaid pay for personal care assistance to support people in their homes. So it's not that we're trying to neglect people and not help them, but we don't need to incarcerate them to do so. So things like, in-home care, things like peer respite for families, that kind of thing. And I'll just quickly quote something she said in the book, quote, "Instead of pouring millions of research dollars into devising yet another set of 5 questions to figure out who is going to commit suicide," and this is my aside here, we're obsessed with predicting suicide, but what do we do when we've identified these people, right? So she suggests, diverting that money to PCAs, crisis respite, paying for someone to provide a personal connection and help out another person who's floundering and desperate, unquote. Just another few things I'll add. This narrative has persisted, and I agree with it, right? That if there was actual investment in voluntary services and the things that people are clearly saying we want and need this and can't access this, then the need for, I don't ever think there's a need, but involuntary treatment would decrease, right? But we've never actually enacted this scenario to find out, right? We haven't. And at this point, it's not super clear to me, even if somehow we were to robustly fund a community system, who would work in the settings? The worker shortage is getting worse every single day, right? So there's lots of us, particularly folks in the abolition space, who think that more funding for mental health care will not get us out of the carceral cycle that we are addicted to in this country. When at the same time, we are criminally neglecting basic survival needs of people, right? That's happening. And so, again, I really, really recommend, there's a whole bunch of policy suggestions in that problem creating courts report that is put on by, created by abolitionist organizers, and talking about things like housing, housing first, permanent supportive housing, guaranteed income so people aren't living in the stress of poverty. That would have helped my mother so much, right? All of these things that are not considered mental health care, but are of course intrinsic to people's mental health, right? So that's like a whole bunch of policy decisions and legal changes that, I can't go into now. And I think the path of, I just want to briefly, I know I'm going on, I have like 2 more points, but the path of reform, I think is a path, right? I do believe in diversity of tactics, but I see reform efforts replicating these carceral structures just with upgrades and rebrands and new facades. I'll just briefly share Milwaukee, which is where I'm from, and it was the site of my mother's abuse in the system. They just went through a 10-year redesign, like a big decades-long reform process. So we got a brand new crisis center and a brand new hospital. But what I'll say about the crisis center is that it has separate entrances for voluntary and involuntary folks. And I can imagine the involuntary entrance is hidden out of sight. I don't know if y'all would agree with me. I'm guessing. I haven't been there to see it. It's very ominous and creepy to me to have these segregated entrances, right? So is this really change, or is it more of the same, right? So I think it's really important to think when you're getting involved in reform efforts, is this deepening, strengthening the existing system, or is it doing something to dismantle it? The last thing I'll say is I am an abolitionist. I believe in psychiatric abolition. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't have access to meds or care that they want, but the way it's being done now really needs to be dismantled. And I really, really encourage y'all to read the essay, Abolition Must Include Psychiatry by Stella Akua-Mensah and Steph Kaufman-Kimthulu. It's an excellent piece that really breaks down, the whole argument much better than I have time for now. And I would say, I think a lot of things need to change. I think everything needs to change, but we have a real problem, not just with funding and allocation of resources, but with political will and with saneism, right? Which was talked about in Steph's panel. So the saneism piece, right? And the assumption that we are dangerous to society, we are incompetent, we have to be put places, right? So in the spaces that you occupy, I really would encourage everybody to be educating about ableism and saneism and how it shows up in care, in healthcare, in the spaces we have influence, to really rehumanize people with psychosocial disabilities in our society.
Thank you so much, Leah, and thank you, Leigh. At this point, we'd like to open it up to questions. If you are participating on the virtual, please put it in the Q&A. If there are people in the room who have questions, please indicate if you're directing it to one of us in particular, or if you want all of us to answer. Thanks.
We've got one question in the audience. Let me just pass the mic on.
Hello, everybody. This is Tony Hatch asking a question. It's really, despite the fire alarm, really lovely to kind of have a continuous train of thought. And thank you so much for your reflections on these practices of involuntary commitment and forced drugging and whatnot. I guess my question is for Leigh, for the psychiatrist, and that is, you describe a kind of process of disillusion and disenchantment with what you were taught while in training, right, to become a psychiatrist. And I'm curious about what you think, how the current system of medical education for psychiatrists, is it possible, what are the contours of reform needed to expand, that particular training, to kind of minimize the disillusionment, minimize the unlearning that has to happen, that's happened subsequently for you, if that question makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and one that I don't have concrete bullet points for, but one that I hope to develop over time. What I think we need to make sure we make room for is making sure everybody feels comfortable doing this, talking with residents about their responses to this, to the different aspects of the mental health system, the part that seems aligned with their personal values and the parts that don't, and then making sure that people who are questioning have a space where they can talk about it without feeling like they are going to, I may have not had any consequences to talking about this as a resident. Maybe I should have. Maybe other people felt the same way. But I didn't know where those folks were. All I know is that when I was working, and I didn't do my residency in Connecticut, I want to make that very clear. And the laws where I did my residency were very different than they are in Connecticut. But that being said, involuntary care still happened. And I guess I think I'm not as in touch with resident education as somebody who could be able to answer this question more articulately, but just based on my own personal history, I think just making sure we check in with residents and say, does this seem like it aligns with what you think is right? And even just talking it through a little bit more. I'm sorry, I don't have anything more concrete to say, but actually, no, I do. Really is fundamentally connecting people with lived experience, helping residents connect with the advocacy community, making sure we know that we are part of a larger society and that we're all able to change how we show up. And if we listen to each other, we can learn about how we're showing up. And that's the very beginning of knowing what to do next. We have to understand before we can act. So teaching, helping residents feel mentally prepared for connecting without having to diagnose, without having to act, without having to be the expert, because residents often have a sense we're trying to get our confidence as having some expertise under our belts, and really just pointing out when we have to do that in order to feel like we're acting confidently, and other times when we need to just focus highly on humility. There's an interesting, I want to respond to Leah's comments about the book by Susan Stefan, Rational Suicide, Irrational Laws. That book I highly recommend. And maybe, so as I'm free associating here, I would say read a lot about laws, read a lot about what advocates write, read a lot about what people with lived experience write, read. That book is incredible. It's long, but you're spot on, Leigh, about the patient care waivers. Another book that I highly recommend and was actually passed on to me by somebody who trained me is called Committed. It's written by 2 psychiatrists, Dinah Miller and Annette Hansen. And you can see Dr. Miller wrestling with involuntary care. And she even reflects on the training experience and how humility and training can sometimes be hard to master with confidence. I'll stop there.
We did get one virtual question from Melanie. How does child psychiatry fit in the conversation, especially children in the foster system or with an intellectual disability? I just have to say, for me, CLRP, we represent adults, we don't represent children. You know, there are lawyers who do. I think that people who, I didn't enter the system till I was an adult. I don't know if Leah, you had experience being treated as a minor. I think you mentioned that. So you might have some useful input. And Leigh, after Leah goes, if you have something to add, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think recognizing the importance of keeping families together, you know, to the greatest extent possible, because that's not how it's really working now. And I don't know how child psychiatrists could be allies in that. But I think that's a huge piece of it. And recognizing the role, right, that psychology, I'll just briefly share, you know, there was a psychologist who evaluated my mother and I, and his recommendations were taken 100%, right, over hers, and, you know, almost to the letter. So just, you know, understanding the power, you know, that is held, and really working to dismantle the harms of the foster care system, the family police system, child protective services, all need to be dismantled and abolished.
We got one last question in the audience, and then we'll wrap up the session. So go right ahead.
Thanks. I have a comment and a question. So the comment is, I'm a psychiatrist and a hospital administrator, and one could easily conclude from looking at the system that we have that those in my position are all on the wrong side. And yet I can tell you, I agree with close to all of what you've said today. And I know a lot of other hospital administrators who feel the same way. The question then is, can you envision a way that people like me could be engaged in this process? Because some days it feels like, short of quitting our jobs, you know, there's not a lot we can do to fix the system. And if I quit my job, there'll be somebody else. But I know a lot of psychiatrists who work in hospitals and other hospital administrators who don't want the system to be the way it is, but are struggling from inside to change it. And I wonder whether there are ways to ally across these different systems and bring about change both from the outside and from the inside.
I can start with that. Absolutely, there are ways to work together. And I will say I absolutely recognize, because I do see it every day, there are people on the inside of these systems who recognize that the system itself is problematic, needs to change, but you're working within it. So how much change can you do from your side? But recognize us as allies. And I say that especially as an attorney who works for Connecticut Legal Rights Project. We are all there to serve the same people. We're just serving them in different ways. And if you can recognize that we're there to play a role, the hospital is there to play a role, but we're all there to serve the individual people. And if we really focus on what they're telling us that they want from all of us collectively, we are a lot more likely to get there. I think there are lots of opportunities for us to work collaboratively on changing laws that need to be changed. And I think there are a lot of times where we talk past each other. I think things like conferences like this are great because we're actually talking with each other, and that makes a huge difference.
Can I just say a quick thing? I think administrators can lead by example, that you value lived experience, because I can tell you, I've been on grand rounds, and when the lived experience person talks, everybody hightails it if you don't have a degree. So really emphasizing to the folks that you work with that this is important, something they need to be paying attention to, and using your leadership to help sort of change the mindset in a lot of these hospitals.
And I want to echo that as well. We need, and kind of adding to my previous response, train everyone. So model for residents, model for staff, model for psychiatrists, model for other administrators to center people with lived experience. And we've got to work together and get to know one another as people and respect each other as people who all, like Kathy said, all want the same thing. And we have to find really the space and the time where we come together, connect, and work together to change the stuff that's got to be changed.
Thank you all for such a wonderful and thoughtful panel. If we could have a round of applause, please. So we'll now start our coffee break for those who are in person. The next session is going to start at 3:30. Thanks for your patience as we ran over due to the fire alarm situation. So feel free to go to the restroom, have some coffee, take a snack break. And for our folks online, we'll be resuming again at 3:30. Thank you.